Recordsure on the new consumer duty regulations that are coming into force next July. I'm Gary Evans, Chief Product Officer of Recordsure, which is a RegTech business with a mission to deliver AI-powered technology to help regulated business improve the efficiency and the effectiveness of QA across the full customer lifecycle, whether the communication is verbal or written. I'm also the Chief Product Officer of Recordsure sister company TCC, which is a 20-year pedigree compliance consultancy business that also offers specialist resource and managed services solutions for BAU advice, suitability and remediation. Now, before I talk a bit about the purpose of today's webinar and hand you over to my esteemed colleagues to introduce themselves, I want to cover off a few housekeeping bits. So we are due to run for 45 minutes today, and I'll attempt to get us all finished by 2:45. Although given how much I like the sound of my own voice and how knowledgeable my colleagues are, that might be a little challenge, but I'll try my best. The webinar is being recorded, and we will share the output with all registered attendees tomorrow. And whilst we all like to talk on this webinar, we want to make sure we're talking about the things that you want to hear about. So we'd really appreciate if you could engage with us and ask questions as we go through using the Q&A functionality of Zoom. If there is an opportunity for me to throw them in during the appropriate part of the webinar, I will. Else, we will try to answer what we can at the end of the webinar, time permitting. Let me just get rid of this so we can see. There you go. So from the purpose, so today is the second in a series of 3 webinars focused on consumer duty. And in our first webinar, we set the scene for what the duty entails, and we discussed some of the challenges that we've been hearing from firms. We also talked about some of the conversations we were having with organisations about consumer duty, and that indicated to us that they weren't necessarily taking the change in regulations seriously enough and thought they were already compliant. Now, if I can work the technology properly, which isn't always the case, I can show you that, he says, they're seamless. The FCA appear to share some of the same concerns that we do. And in fact, we're hearing some rumblings from the FCA that they're likely to make an example of a number of organisations to demonstrate how serious they really are about consumer duty, and to highlight some of the expectations that there are going to be of firms moving into the new regulatory regime. Good. Now, in today's webinar, we're going to be talking about some of those regulatory expectations and the changes from the old regime, which I definitely won't refer to as TCF, because referring to as TCF implies that consumer duty is simply TCF on steroids, and it's been made abundantly clear to me that it isn't. So the move from the old regime to the new regime, and a bit about how firms can approach the challenges of the new regime to achieve successful compliance, both in the long term as well as on day one, and with a particular focus on defining and testing outcomes. And also, now that the 31st of October deadline for board-approved implementation plans is passed, we'll be providing our view of where you should be by now. So enough of me. I'm gonna hand over the baton to my esteemed colleagues to introduce themselves. Neil, could I ask you to go first, please?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Gary. Neil Dethick, Associate Director at TCC, and leading on the consumer duty initiatives, and I've been speaking to many firms about how this is all to be taken forward. So getting a good view of the industry approach to consumer duty over the last few months.
Marvellous, thank you, Neil. And last but by no means least, Olivia.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Olivia Fahy. So I'm a Senior Product Manager at Recordsure and also a member of the Recordsure and TCC Group's cross-working group consumer duty team. I've been at Recordsure for nearly 2 years, and before that I worked at the FCA within supervision for nearly 5 years. Thank you very much.
Right then, so we're going to move on to our panel discussion. So for the next 25 minutes or so, we're going to cover off some regulatory expectations, what we think, how CD will be supervised. And then we'll also talk a little bit about outcomes and how kind of outcome testing versus the typical kind of traditional QA is different, and kind of how they can support one another. But first, onto regulatory expectations. So in the last webinar, we did talk about the clear difference between TCF and consumer duty, and the fact that this perhaps isn't really appreciated across the industry. And one of the areas that lots of firms aren't fully clear on is how the FCA is going to approach supervision and enforcement of consumer duty. And in the conversations I've been having over the past few weeks, one of the questions I regularly hear is whether we believe the FCA are going to monitor the progress against the implementation plans on how organisations are closing the consumer duty gaps. Neil, you've been having those conversations more than I have. What's your view on this?
Well, we mentioned implementation plans in the last webinar, and the fact that the FCA has asked firms to create implementation plans was a key signal that the FCA want firms to take this seriously, and that a higher standard needs to be adhered to. It's not just TCF under a different guise, as we keep mentioning. FCA are looking for assurance that firms have engaged with the substance of the duty, and they've also engaged with the step change that they're looking to see. And we know that some firms, we heard only last week that some firms had already received requests from the FCA to see their implementation plans, and they'll be scrutinising those, one would imagine, over the next few weeks. So the quick answer, Gary, the summary answer is yes, the FCA are going to monitor the progress of how firms are implementing the duty.
Marvellous. And Neil, where do you think people should be by now then? What's the state of play that you would expect in an organisation that is on track to be ready for consumer duty next year?
So the implementation plans needed to have been board approved by the end of last month, as I think everyone will know. And then obviously depending on the level of change that's required in each firms will dictate how far forward they would need to be. There should be a wide awareness throughout the organisations of consumer duty, and an awareness of some of the changes that will be needed in their processes, policies and operations. So that should now be starting to be shared and agreed at least the board level and filtering down to the staff. Working groups should be considering exactly what actions need to be taken and how they're going to take those, and indeed when those actions will be enacted. So whilst there's still 8.5 months, I guess, until consumer duty needs to be ready, the call for action is there. Firms should be well on the way to understanding exactly where action needs to be taken.
Marvellous, thank you. And then, so I guess if that's kind of where we're at the moment, the other big question is, how are the FCA going to be supervising? So if they're looking to monitor and measure compliance to consumer duty, what will they be doing? Will they be auditing? How is that going to be done? And if you're kind of ex of the FCA, you kind of know how the land lies. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, it's the $1 million question really, right? And I think it's the thing that a lot of firms are looking for answers to, and perhaps feel like the FCA haven't been particularly clear in relation to how they are going to be supervising or monitoring the consumer duty. And I think part of that comes down to the challenge of it being a cross-sector piece of regulation, right? So it isn't necessarily something that they can apply a one-size-fits-all approach to. But that does align with the way they've kind of shifted supervision in general over the last couple of years, which is to take a portfolio approach to supervision. So essentially, you know, all of the firms that the FCA is supervising are grouped into portfolios based on their business models. And the FCA have said that that's essentially the first kind of level of the way those strategies will be developed. So they'll be looking at the specific harms that exist within individual portfolios, within individual sectors, and they'll be developing a strategy that is aligned to those. And those strategies are communicated through kind of general firm engagement, Dear CEO letters. And we've already actually seen some of those that have been published for specific sectors that are full of consumer duty language, clearly have kind of the consumer duty outcomes as their North Star. And that is really the thing that the FCA are going to be focusing on. In terms of how they are actually going to be gathering information and supervising it, I think what they've said is that they're going to be utilising their usual supervisory engagement. So essentially what they're going to be doing, and again, this is something they've done with kind of other new pieces of regulation that have come into play over the last couple of years, is that they're embedding it in their general supervisory practices. So it isn't going to be something that sits alongside the way they supervise, that, you know, one day they'll go, oh, we need to do some consumer duty supervision, let's go and talk to a firm about that. It's going to be something that is just fully ingrained in all their supervisory practices. And that could be, you know, for the larger firms, the firms that the FCA refers to as fixed firms, that will be, you know, they have named supervisors that they'll engage with on a regular basis, and that will be the way that they're gathering information about consumer duty outcomes. For smaller firms, it'll be kind of more targeted multi-firm work, so looking at perhaps specific issues they're concerned about, going out and looking at those in a group of firms, then publishing the outcomes of those. And in some ways it makes it a little bit more challenging for firms, because it isn't something you can wait for the call on, or kind of wait and be like, right, we'll just wait until we get something that says they're going to be looking at the consumer duty, and then we can kind of make sure that we've got everything in place for it. Because actually every engagement the FCA will be having with you as a firm, they'll be utilising to inform their view of whether taking the consumer duty seriously, whether you have taken those steps, whether you are engaging with, as Neil said, that step change that they're looking for, and ultimately whether the outcomes that they're looking for are being produced. So it is really something that needs to be considered across the board in everything, because that's the way the FCA is going to be looking at it.
Thank you very much. Now, if supervision is the #1 topic on everyone's lips when it comes to consumer duty, the second topic is enforcement. I guess the sense I've got from the conversation I've had is there doesn't feel to be the jeopardy there at the moment on consumer duty. So some of the complacency, some of the sense of I don't really need to do much on this yet, or I've got other priorities which are more important to grow my business, comes from the fact that they believe that the FCA aren't really going to do anything about this. You know, it'll get to the 31st of July next year, and yes, now there's some new regulation enforced, but they're not going to do anything about it. They find something wrong, they'll give me another year. So what's your opinion on kind of how the FCA are going to approach enforcement?
So I think, so I guess to start with, you know, from what the FCA have said, they have said it is going to be enforceable. And a lot of that is because actually, as we've said, this isn't just an extension of the previous regime that will not be named. It is, you know, it isn't just a principle with some guidance that sits beneath it. They have put rules in place that therefore can be breached and therefore can be enforced against. And that's, you know, they put the cross-cutting rules in place. They're supported by the 4 outcomes, which also set out more detailed rules in those key areas. And they have said they are going to, if there are serious breaches, they will enforce against them. And you know, that could be through their intervention powers, such as requirement or variation of permissions, or it could be use of their deterrent powers, which are obviously through fines, or through remediation, which would be through requiring redress. That is all something that takes quite a bit of time, because obviously to get to enforcement, there does have to have been some serious misconduct. So, and you would hope actually that the majority of firms that won't be something that a position they would end up in, because you would hope that the majority of firms won't be kind of in that kind of space of causing serious misconduct. But there is also a whole suite of supervisory interventions that could be put in place that are almost a precursor to any sort of enforcement action, which, while it isn't enforcement, you know, things like Section 166s and things like that, while it isn't enforcement, it is still increased regulatory scrutiny. These things can become public, so there's increased reputational risk, and also there's cost associated with it, just because you have to put more people on top of kind of managing those risks that have been identified. I think from a more personal opinion based view is that the FCA have themselves been under quite a lot of scrutiny over the last few years. There's been a lot of, you know, things that have come out in the press of areas where they've maybe missed things. It's created harm for consumers as a result. So I think they probably will be looking to make a bit of a mark with this, and that they will be taking it seriously. So I think it is likely that, you know, they'll be looking to be quite firm when it comes to the way that they are doing those kind of like serious supervisory interventions, but also the potential need to move to enforcement.
Yeah, and it does make sense. I mean, if there's a general level of apathy in the industry about this, then the FCA can't let that happen. There can't be ongoing apathy, otherwise the new regime doesn't actually make any traction, doesn't deliver the things that they're after. So you're right, it makes perfect sense. Kind of woe betide the chosen firms, I suppose, who are going to get the books thrown at them right from the off. Now, in the first webinar, I spoke quite a lot about the biggest change for Consumer Duty is about the requirement to evidence outcomes rather than demonstrate policies and processes, for example. Where do you see the role of data and data strategies for organisations in their plans to become compliant?
Yeah, so I think the data strategy element is something that is the FCA have been talking about, but I don't think it's had kind of a huge amount of attention necessarily paid to it. And it's something that I think is actually really interesting, because they have said that they are looking for firms to have a data strategy in place. They've said that if new firms are looking to be authorised, it's going to be something that they will start looking at, which is, their data strategy for how they are going to be compliant with the Consumer Duty. And they've also, it also aligns with what they've been saying themselves about they want to become a data-led regulator, and that they're going to be relying a lot more on data as they kind of monitor the implementation of the duty. So I think the way that firms are using data, the kind of the tools they have in place are going to be really important, and it's something that they should be thinking really seriously about, because it is something that the FCA is signalling that they, that they're looking for. And I think as well, it can be, when you have kind of new massive piece of regulation like this, it can be really easy to get caught up in kind of the date that the regulation comes into force, and just think that, okay, that's day one, everything needs to be in place by that point. And then it's almost like we've got there, we've made it, we can breathe a sigh of relief. But I think for something like this, that is actually, a piece of regulation that the FCA is saying is, they're looking for it to create culture change and behavioural change in the industry. It's almost actually, I think, a bit more important to think about, well, actually, yeah, day one's great, you want everything to be in place, but how do you sustain that from day two onwards and make sure that it is sustainable and that it's embedded? And I think that is, again, kind of linking to kind of, well, what data can you use, what tools and techniques can you put in place that can actually provide you with that assurance that it is something that is going to be sustainable from day two and beyond, rather than just kind of, we've crossed the finish line. It's not a finish line, it's a starting line. And I think that sometimes can be lost in the fear of a deadline date that's put in place.
No, that's very fair. I think from all the conversations I've had, there's been an awful lot more focus on how do I get ready for day one, rather than what actually is my BAU process, because this isn't a thing. You're absolutely right. This is the future, and it'll be how we have to work ongoing from here. And some of those, I think there's been a lot of focus on the product and fair value of products outcome, which is something you can almost do an exercise on and get it done. And so as of the day when, as long as we've got a process for new products, we're sorted. But a lot of the other stuff, a lot of the outcome monitoring, that is simply a BAU transition that you need to make. No, that's really interesting, and miraculously segues beautifully into our next topic, which is outcome testing. So we wanted to kind of cover off what outcome testing versus kind of standard kind of quality assurance is. Kind of what's the difference? How can one support another? And the reason why we've put this into this webinar is a lot of the questions in the last webinar kind of focused very much on these outcomes and good outcomes. What are they and how do they work? So I'm going to go to a couple of pre-submitted questions from the previous webinar, and I'm going to ask you for your opinion, my esteemed panel. So the first question is, what evidence will be acceptable of a good customer outcome? For example, will financial services providers be required to survey customers or provide evidence that consumers have been asked whether they feel they've received a good outcome or good value, etc.? What if the majority of consumers don't wish to provide feedback? What might constitute a representative sample? Neil, can I come to you first for that one?
Yeah, sure. Well, as we know, the FCA's approach these days is a show me, don't tell me approach. So evidence of compliance with the duty is going to be crucial as we move forward. Customer surveys are good and do provide valuable information, but are limited in terms of providing all the evidence that one's required. And if we look at a couple of examples of the four outcomes from the duty, we can give some examples of what we think the evidence will be needed, what will prove compliance with the policy. So, for example, if we take the customer support or the consumer support outcome, and firms should be asking themselves at the moment, what channels are available for the client to access your services, whether it's telephone, email, face-to-face, or a web chat, etc. And does that channel meet the needs of your firm's target market? Other questions, for example, what channels are available that may better meet the needs of potentially vulnerable clients? Is your process stopping clients acting in a way that's detrimental to their best interests? And does the communication channels enable clients to get the support as they need it and when they need it? And then you add that to the different service propositions that are on offer and ask yourself, what support do you provide? And decide on the areas you wish to test that will provide the evidence for duty compliance. The evidence that is then available will show you how you thought about the consumer support outcome and how that will impact the service you provide. On perhaps another example would be the consumer understanding outcome. And again, this is just a representative sample of some of the evidence you might need to consider. So with consumer understanding, perhaps you need to identify and document key touch points and communications with clients, and then document why that communication is needed, when the communication is made, the channel that communication involves, the likely recipients, the target market, if you will, and the potential for risk and harm to the client if that communication is not understood. If you've asked yourself those questions, you should document these touch points and the communications that are the most important in delivering good client outcomes, in order that you can then evidence why you will focus on these for improvement and testing in the future. So as I say, that's just a representative sample of some of the areas where evidence is required. As customer surveys will help show an element of application of the duty, but it certainly won't show the whole picture. So while they're useful, it won't be the panacea of all ills.
No, I think you're absolutely right, Neil. In fact, I had a fascinating conversation with a big retail bank a couple of weeks ago, and they were talking about this kind of portfolio approach to evidence, and that they kind of had a view, and admittedly they are quite a bit further forward than the majority of organisations I've spoken to, but they spoke about, they had structured data about the consumer that they captured both at the kind of acquisition stage and during the customer management stage, and that told them a lot of information about a consumer and kind of their support needs, their vulnerability, kind of what products they have, what type of social demographic kind of background they had, and by combining that with the insights from the core recordings that they had and the communications that they were engaged with the consumer, plus a survey, plus then some further structured data about how the customer was actually utilising the products that they were consuming from the organisation. They could collate all of that into a coherent kind of end-to-end picture of that consumer and their journey and their outcomes. And I thought that was incredibly forward thinking. I thought it was, I mean, admittedly, the guy did admit to me that this was something that he's been thinking about for a long time as the right thing to do. It just so happens the consumer duty kind of points him in that direction anyway. But I thought that, you know, in terms of thinking about outcomes, and it's not simply about an individual bit. So I agree with you. I don't think surveys are the be all and end all of anything. And in terms of representative samples, I think it's hard to get there because you will only get so many back, and finding a way to incentivize returns on these consumer surveys is always fascinating. But if you get this kind of broad picture of what's happening with your consumers, it certainly, I think, if they were able to take that to the FCA as evidence of good outcomes, I think the FCA would be very pleased. I think it might cause some problems for everybody else, because if that is the kind of level that is achievable, then I think the bar will be kind of raised by the FCA. Which and of course I talk about a kind of a major tier 1 retail bank there, which brings me very nicely into one of the other things we kind of picked up briefly on in the last webinar, which was the fact that the FCA have called out that the regulation is to be proportionate. So Neil, how do you think proportionality comes into play, and to what extent does it apply to consumer duty and the requirements of organisations under the new regime?
Yeah. Well, the FCA has said that the duty, under proportionality, the duty will require what can reasonably be expected of a prudent firm carrying on the same activity for the same product or service. So if we take an example of what that might actually mean, under the, let's say, the products and services outcome, the rules will take into account the firm's role in relation to the product or service that they offer, the nature of the product or service, and the characteristics of their consumers. So whilst firms need to apply the rules for all products or services, the requirements are less onerous for simpler products with less risk to consumer harm. So that's one area of proportionality that would need to be accounted for. If we look at the consumer support outcome, again, the FCA wouldn't expect a firm to test every client communication for compliance of the duty, but they would look for the firms to identify the most important communications they issue, document why they're important, and then test those important documents against the consumer duty requirements. So proportionality is very much a key focus of this, and I'd recommend that if further information is needed on the proportionality aspects, the FCA's consultation paper CP 21/36 does give an awful lot more guidance on that matter.
Thanks, Neil. That's really helpful.
Just add one thing to that, because I think just something that is could be quite interesting, because I think it's one of those things again that I think firms can get a bit frustrated with the FCA when they're saying, you're saying it's proportionate, but you're not giving me any information about what you're comparing me to. So how am I supposed to know what proportionality is? And I think quite an interesting or quite useful internal test for that is to say, well, what, in comparison to the other things you gather MI on, are you paying the same level of attention to consumer duty outcomes as you are to, for example, sales? Because if actually you've got loads and loads of data on how many sales you're doing, but you've got kind of, maybe one, consumer survey outcome metric that is analysing your consumer outcomes, there's a mismatch there. So I think there's a bit of an element of firms can almost apply it internally and say, well, are we paying the same level of attention to this as we are the other areas that we view as important? And if we're not, we need to look at what other metrics or data we can look at that will help bring it up to the same level.
Oh no, that's fascinating. And I think back to some of my previous companies, and the fact that actually the sales conversion funnel had about 14 pages to it, and a huge amount of effort and time spent on it, whereas the consumer satisfaction was a kind of a monthly review to make sure it was okay. That does bring it to life really quite nicely, actually. That's what proportionate means. If you are a major retail bank and you've got 5 people dedicated to the sales function, sales MI, chances are you'll have a few people dedicated to this anyway, and you'll be proportionate. So it's almost not so much proportionate to the size of your business, but proportionate to all the other things you're looking at. Fascinating, like that. Thank you very much. Now the last question that I had, that was the pre-selected ones, was what learning or upskilling can companies provide colleagues with to prepare them for the requirements of consumer duty? Who wants to go first?
I'll jump in if you like, Gary. Yeah, so training, upskilling. It's fair to say that the duty will impact all staff at one level or another. It's not something that stops and starts at board level or at the client-facing staff, for example. It filters down throughout the organisation. Certainly, if you look at the senior management functions under SM and CR, there's a huge impact of consumer duty on the senior management in the firm. They're the people who are accountable for the implementation, the application and the ongoing monitoring of consumer duty within the firm. So the upskilling of the board, if you will, is going to be a key part. That could involve interpretation of MI and data and the monitoring results of consumer duty and understanding what that data is telling the board and therefore what actions they need to take as a result. It can impact, obviously, the client-facing staff and the upskilling of the client-facing staff in being able, for example, to spot and identify client vulnerabilities as they're talking to them and being able to action those as they become evident. And then you've got your support staff. The implication of the duty on support staff is being able to deliver the service that is promised to clients. So do they understand the support that they need to provide? Do they understand, do support staff know their role in providing a degree of consumer understanding and support throughout the product lifestyle? So upskilling is going to be a big thing. The training is something that we've seen an awful lot of firms start to think about what each role is going to play in the delivery of the duty. And some implementation plans we've reviewed focus very much on the individual staff, very much on the senior management functions and ensuring that their responsibilities are well known. So a key part of the duty will be the delivery of the training, the upskilling of all members of staff at all levels.
Thanks, Neil. Olivia, have you got anything to add?
I think just from my perspective, I think it's again thinking about that, what I was saying earlier about the kind of day two onwards element of it as well. So I think sometimes, again, when this type of regulation comes in, it's like, okay, get some mandatory training in place so everyone knows what the consumer duty is. And again, we can tick a box to say people have been trained, but actually how do you embed the behavioural changes that are required to mean that it is something that is going to create change and there is going to be a focus on outcomes. And actually, if there are going to be, you know, if there's a, you know, if you're going to change the types of kind of systems or the types of processes that you're using, then actually it's how do you make sure that staff understand why that's happening and the reasons for it, so that, you know, it is building kind of new habits and changes in behaviour, as opposed to just kind of thinking, oh, okay, we've done some mandatory training on this, we can just kind of go back to the way things were.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. That makes perfect sense. And I'd be remiss coming from a RegTech business with a series of technology products and being a kind of a techie man at heart, to not kind of move into the almost the next part of this panel, asking what role data and technology can play in providing some of the solutions and enabling organizations to become compliant with consumer duty. Olivia, I've got one for you as senior product manager for Recordsure. That's surely one for you.
Yeah, so I think you know, in a really kind of overarching answer, the answer is it can play a huge role. So I think it's always easier to talk about this in the context of kind of a specific example. So I think quality assurance in QA, which you mentioned earlier, is actually a really good example to look at in this context, because obviously QA kind of processes are all about looking at has the right thing happened for a customer. It's looking at direct consumer advisor interaction. So it is looking at kind of frontline consumer service and whether they have achieved the right outcomes. But it can often be a bit of an undervalued process because you know, it might be seen as a bit burdensome. There's often kind of ratios around it and, you know, targets that you have to hit in terms of the percentages of calls that you need to be looking at. And also because it is pretty impossible because of the number of communications that happen. It's pretty impossible to ever look at 100% of interactions that have ever happened, because you would need just a huge amount of compliance staff to be able to do that. So firms have to end up relying on random sampling, which means that actually you can get useful information out of it on a kind of individual feedback basis on specific calls, but it's difficult to identify any sort of thematic trends, any cross-team or cross-function training and competence needs, or any actual potential root where there could be potential root causes of harm that is happening, in this frontline service. And that is all super, super valuable insight. And I think it's processes like this which are historically very human led and focused on just kind of trying to get a representative sample, but doing it randomly, where tech can actually play a really massive role, because there's a lot of those QA functionality type processes, which is just about doing a bit of tick boxing, so checking that processes have been followed and that kind of the right things have been happening. And that's where actually kind of machines can help and technology can help in the kind of, I call it like the wheel cranking type tasks, because they can kind of, a piece of technology can do that, and then can help basically direct the actual human reviewers that you have and the people who have really valuable insights and the subject matter experts to looking at the cases that they need to look at and gaining those insights. So it's a way of freeing up resource to actually do tasks like outcomes testing that subjective opinions or assessments are needed for, but the areas where there's kind of objective tasks that are literally just things that need to be kind of done, technology can really step in and play kind of an incredibly valuable role there.
Thank you. That does resonate actually, and I've had two conversations lately. As you can tell, I don't have any of my own original thoughts anymore. I just take thoughts from other people in conversations I have. But I was talking to one compliance leader at a major mortgage company, and he said, I did 1,000 compliance checks in the 1 month. Big team, 1,000 compliance checks, and identified 3 calls where the same thing was happening. So I took that to my head of business and said, I think you have a problem. Here's 3 examples. To which the head of business responded, I did 120,000 calls last month. You brought me 3 examples. I can't do anything with that. And that is a kind of the thing that happens because of random sampling. When you random sample and you have a fairly high compliance rate, which kind of all kind of reputable organizations do, then if you're only kind of reviewing 10 or 15% of cases and only kind of 3 or 4% of those cases are bad, you're not going to see many bad cases. And that kind of creates massive problems for being able to identify those trends and problems. If you had a really terrible compliance rate, actually your sample size could be quite small, and statistically you'd get a decent trend analysis. But because it isn't, because everyone does such a good job, but the impact of a bad call is significant. And when that volume of calls, even kind of a 2% bad rate on 120,000, there's a lot of people who are getting bad outcomes. That hits home. And then the other conversation which I had this morning, actually, which was timely, was about some of that. If you're doing 100% call reviewing and being able to identify what the kind of broader trends and problems are, that was seen as an added bonus to a cost benefit analysis that was able to be done by putting a product in place historically. But over the last 6 months, the controls people have come in, and the controls people are now looking at what is done from a QA framework perspective, and what has turned from now an additional bonus has now become a must-have. So they're using that as a major kind of rubber stamp for their consumer duty compliance, that they are able to identify the issues and be able to, and not just identify the issues, but potentially fix them, so that they can't. It's what starts off as a bad outcome becomes a good outcome, and that kind of solves the problem and mitigates any future risk. but also using that then to feed back into the front of the journey so that they can improve the performance of the processes and the people so that those bad calls don't happen in the future. So it feels like, you're right, I mean, that, and I would say this, I'm from a data and technology business, but it does feel like there's a huge part to play.
I think as well, it's, linked to that. I think that's a really forward thinking way of looking at things, because I think, with my ex-regulator hat on, there's been this push from the FCA. They want to become a proactive regulator. They want to see firms proactively identifying harm. They don't want it to be reactive, that is, mis-selling scandals that appear years later because of all this, stuff that kind of was under the covers. And it can be a bit scary when you are only looking at a small portion of calls to think, well, there's a big dark area over there, the 97%. I don't know what's going on in it. So do I really want to know? But I just think from all perspectives, from a perspective of, being proactive, from a consumer duty perspective, from a culture perspective, it's just better to know what's going on so that you can address it than kind of stick your head in the sand until something comes to light that then could be just so much, it could have crystallized to such an extent that it becomes so much worse than it would have been if you'd known in the first place. So I think that is, it's a bit of a scary mindset change maybe, but I do think it's the right one, particularly in the world of consumer duty.
No, I think you're right. And the whole kind of ostrich in the sand scenario, which I've heard a couple of times of, if there's more problems out there, I don't want to know about them because I don't have the resource or the money to deal with them. I think is a perception that the random sampling doesn't give you a real reflection of how bad your calls are. And actually, I mean, statistically, whilst you don't get the thematic ones, if you've got a consistent 3% bad rate over the last 3 years, you've got a 3% bad rate. And whether you're reviewing kind of 5%, 10% or 100%, you'll still have a 3% bad rate. But you're better off knowing exactly what all of those calls are and what all of the themes are, rather than just a very small amount of them.
Yeah.
I am conscious of time, so I'm going to stop you. We've got 3 minutes left, and I'm for the first time in my life, I'm going to finish something on time and not be late. I've got there's 2 questions that have come in that I wanted to pick up on. So the first one is, ongoing compliance with consumer duty is going to require a lot of investment at a time where costs are being squeezed. What's the right balance between people investment and tech investment? Who wants to pick that one?
I can go for that. If
I
keep talking.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it actually links to what you were saying just then, Gary, is actually. So I think some of the fear is that, the people investment of required for full compliance or 100% oversight is just too high. Like it would be, to hire the number of people to do this would just be too expensive. And I think that's where actually, it is a balance. But actually, if you invest in technology for those things that it's really good at, so for example, applying consistent processes or consistent AI type models across conversations, for example, to look at whether the right things are happening, increased effectiveness, they're areas where you can make savings, and then you can use the people for what they're best at, which is that kind of subjective side of things. So I think it's kind of looking at, well, where can we utilize tech smartly and where can we utilize people in the best way, and then kind of offsetting that balance, but not just thinking that the only investment in consumer duty has to be in people resource within compliance teams, because I think if you're kind of smart about it, the tech investment arm of it can then make your people even more effective.
No, you're absolutely right. And yeah, I mean, it's obvious in many ways when you think about it, of if you do a 10% sample today and you want to go to 100% sample, then you need 10 times as many people if you're going to do it the way you do it today. Which leads quite nicely to the last question, actually, which I've got 30 seconds to complete on. So that is random sampling good enough in a post-consumer duty world? I think the honest answer very quickly is no. I'd
agree with that. That's a no.
That's a no. Excellent. Thank you, Neil. And I guess this leads us into what the next and last of our webinars is going to be about. So we started off talking about what is consumer duty and what are the challenges. We spent today talking about kind of how the regulation is going to be deployed and what kind of the good outcomes look like. in our last webinar, which is going to be on Wednesday, the 7th of December at 2 p.m, same time as today. We are going to try and delve a little bit into some of the tech solutions that can both aid compliance with consumer duty, but as per kind of Olivia's last point around the balance, also deliver a significant short and long-term cost benefit to organisations. So on that, at 2:45, I want to thank you all for listening, and I look forward to seeing you on Wednesday, the 7th of December at 2 p.m. I'm just leaving to say thank you to Neil and to Olivia for your input today. I've really enjoyed it. I hope everyone at home or wherever you are today have as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.